Robert Altman's The Player is the best film that most people have never seen. For myself, after watching films for decades and always trying to hunt down the best films I could, I'd never even seen this film on any list or mentioned anywhere until I found it on one of the streaming services the other day. I decided to give it a watch. It was certainly one of the better decisions I've made because it was one of my favorite films and has to be one of the ultimate hidden gems out there. Maybe it's just because it was released over 30 years ago now that people don't talk about it anymore. But for me, I found it to be hilarious and just a great parable, I guess, for the state of storytelling and movie making. So let's get into it. The first sort of half an hour of this film just sets the stage for what Hollywood was like in the 90s. Um, it's it goes through the creativity of Hollywood with regards to movie pitches and how most of the movie pitches are just combinations of films that have already come before, and there really is no new or creative ideas. Um, the other thing that sort of happens in this intro is the moniker of "it's not what you know, but who you know." We see Griffin Mill, who's sort of the main character, played by Tim Robbins, traveling around to various locations, restaurants, parties, even at work, and just meeting various famous actors who usually brush him off, him and his counterpart, Larry Levy, who represents the new Hollywood to Griffin's old Hollywood. They're always trying to shove themselves in the face of these famous actors and set up meetings, and the actors are usually brushing them off. The It shows that most of these relationships in these circles are very shallow, and it's a lot of these executives are just desperately trying to keep up with everyone, and that's sort of the hilarity that we see for the first half an hour of the film. Um, the the main characters in this film are, as mentioned, Griffin and Levy, who represent old and new Hollywood. Um, Bonnie, who's Griffin's wife, who's represents the old school audience or like the sophisticated audience who loves interesting films that really respect their audience. Um, then there's David Kahane, who's the writer who gets taken out by Griffin early on in the film. And then there's June, who's the girlfriend of David, but turns out never really respected him too much. And she represents the vapid audience who are looking for formulaic movies and cheap entertainment, which is the direction that Hollywood decides to go. And it's interesting that that is sort of what is the plot of this film, which came out in 1992, given that seems to be a more recent thing that Hollywood moving to more shallow, vapid, and I guess terrible stories and movies. But even back in the early 90s, this was something that was well known. So Griffin starts receiving death threats from an unknown writer, and he believes it to be David Kahane. So he hunts him down with the hopes of offering him a new deal to basically save his life. He gets to know him by calling June, who's David's girlfriend, and he stalks the house that they live in and asks June a whole bunch of personal questions, which June freely hands over to David. It seems like a reasonable person would probably just hang up the phone at this point, but June seems quite bored with her relationship with David, and she's almost willing to live a little dangerously and give herself over to Griffin, despite not knowing much about him or what his intentions are. Um, she claims to be from Iceland, even though she has an English accent, which which Griffin is suspicious of straight away. But it's, I guess, her attempt of being interesting. Um, Once Griffin gets the information that David has seen the bicycle thief, to he goes to the cinema himself to find David, who can be seen slumping in the cinema, like desperately watching old cinema from 60 years before, in the vain hope that maybe he will write a movie that's as revered as that. But the tragedy for David and the writer is that Hollywood's already moved on to more and more vapid films, as evidenced throughout this whole movie, and that his dream of being a writer is is one that is in vain. He says to Griffin when he has an argument with him, "I can write. What can you do?" And then um, and then he's killed about 1 minute later. So it's almost like, yeah, he thinks he's more important than the executive, than the business side of Hollywood because he can write, but he is immediately killed, and it's almost like his writing won't save him. Like, this is a world where the writer is not respected. The next day, Griffin goes to a meeting, and Larry Levy is bold enough to say, like, we don't even need writers. We can come up with these stories on our own. Griffin, who has just killed a writer himself, is a bit, he who's killed a writer, he has more respect for them, and is almost sarcastic when he says, I was just thinking what an interesting concept it is to eliminate the writer from the artistic process completely. Then we can get rid of actors and directors next. Like, Griffin sees it as quite ridiculous, but Levy's sort of, the new age Hollywood, like, writers not important. Um, you know, we're here to make movies, not art films like The Bicycle Thief, which Griffin had just seen. Um, anyway, and then Griffin decides to go to the funeral of David, mainly to cover his tracks. And while he's there, David's friend Phil, is saying that society is responsible for David's death, and then reads out David's last piece of writing. It's an unmemorable, like, it doesn't have any meaning. It's just writing about nonsense, basically. And June, who's meant to be like the grieving girlfriend of David, takes that moment to turn around and scope out Griffin. She's already bored of David, and she comes up to him and says, "You're not a writer," but with interest in her eyes. And um, Griffin says, I'm sorry about David. He was such a talent." And June says, "Oh, I was suspicious he was uniquely untalented," and that she doesn't feel bad. It's like when her parents died, she felt nothing; they were just gone. And June is, not interested in the death of the writer. She's already looking on to the next thing. Um, she asks Griffin to take her home, which he does, and he sees all her art that she has around her place, and he asks who her dealer is, and June says that she couldn't sell them. They never finish, and Griffin's kind of interested in that. He asks her some more questions. June's like, "Oh, you ask a lot of questions, just like the police," and maybe June should be considering why these two parties, the police and Griffin, are asking questions. Instead, she seems to have a complete lack of concern for her own safety, or even that Griffin is dangerous. And Griffin seems to like that about June, that she doesn't seem to have any fear. He's been with Bonnie, who's like the sophisticated audience, but there's something about this complete lack of soul, lack of anything in June that he's attracted to. He calls her a pragmatic anarchist, and then June says, "Is that what I am? I was never sure." Um, it's like she, as an audience, needs to be told who she is, and as we find later in the film, like, all the tricks of film, they're all for the Junes of the world who need to just be told who they are and what to feel. Later on, there's this incredible scene where Tom Oakley pitches an idea for a movie, and the key part is, he says, there are no stars, no happy endings. It's a tragedy watching an innocent woman die, because that happens. That's reality. And it's like, it's this attempt of old Hollywood to still stay at the forefront, to not have all of these, made up formulaic stories. It's like, no, we're going to have a real film. There's going to be no actors. It's too important for that. And Griffin listens to it and he's interested. And then after that, he finds a snake in his car, and he goes over to June's house and says to her, "I came close to dying, and all I could think about was you," which is a very smooth line from an executive, and it's exactly what someone like June would want to hear. Um, and he confesses to her, "The first night we spoke, I was outside these windows watching you," which is a really creepy thing to do and say. But June's almost like, she asks him, are you making love to me?" And Griffin says, "I guess I am." So even though he's showing it being really creepy and there's all these red flags, June's like all in. And she says, in regards to making love, "It's too soon, isn't it?" And what she means is, it's too soon in the movie The Player for them to make love. So we've just gone from a scene about how film needs to be all about reality, to the next scene where we're having this very meta conversation about how the characters can't make love because it would be too soon in the film. And then after this, we see a bit of the decay of old Hollywood. So Griffin reveals that he actually is a fantastic studio executive. He talks about Tom Oakley's pitch, how, even though it sounded great to us as the audience, he says, well, it had no second act, like it's not going to work as a film. And he's put it on Levy, who doesn't know what writing is, and that he's going to bomb, and the studio is going to bomb. Um, and I guess it just shows like this technique that old Hollywood had that is on the way out, and it, eventually we're moving towards a place where it won't even matter whether it's well written or not because the audiences don't even care. Bonnie asks Griffin if he's seen someone else. And then that is like the sophisticated audience asking the studio, is there a new target market, because they're seeing all these new films that suck and are not sophisticated. That did see June in this case, but Griffin like brushes her off and tells her to go on a trip to the East Coast. The very next shot is Griffin walking into like an industry event with June, like, which is pretty funny. And then he delivers a speech about how it's the studio's responsibility to still make great art, which is very ironic because Griffin's the one who's killing the writer and transitioning from Bonnie to June, but he's still feeling he's grappling with his guilt about it. And it's like June said, if you don't feel guilty about it, is it even a crime? Which was in regards to David's death, or that's what Griffin was thinking at the time. But here he is, and he's speaking to an audience who doesn't care what he's saying. Like they don't care that films are not art, And it's almost for Griffin. He's like, well, why am I fighting this almost a losing battle? Like maybe I should just go with June, go with this vapid audience, like become the Larry Levy, which he basically does by the end of the film. Um, then after that, Griffin gets taken in by the police, who are sort of investigating him. He compares Whoopi Goldberg's character, Detective Avery, to another black detective who is in a show or a movie. And then Detective Avery says, is that because I'm a black woman? And Griffin says, actually, I was drawing a comparison not based on race or gender. Now, he has shown that he is quite good at this whole filmmaking thing. And he could be completely sincere in that, but also, how do you know? Like, given some of the vapid choices we're seeing from studio executives throughout the film, maybe it is just about race and gender, and that's enough to make a comparison to someone. But with Griffin, you can give a little bit of the benefit of the doubt. Then they're sort of having a go at him, like, well, did you have sex with June? And Griffin saying, well, um, is there anything wrong with that? Like, they're kind of saying, well, you took advantage, of June, like, who's sort of grieving the death of her boyfriend. What they're really talking about is, you're taking advantage of this audience who are too stupid to know what they want. And Griffin's, it comes back to, well, if I don't feel guilty, is there really a crime? If June wants it, is it really a crime? And that's sort of what he's grappling with over the film, and he leans towards that it's not a crime, but I guess he wants a bit of a pat on the back from the audience of this film that, hey, like, we did think about this, like, we're only doing this because it seems to work for the majority of people. What I mean is producing films that are terrible, the majority of people seem to enjoy that. After that, Bonnie confronts Griffin and says, like, everyone saw you with June. What's that about? And Griffin says, you weren't in town. And what I take that to mean is that, the audience, the sophisticated audience, you weren't coming to films. We were making films for you. You weren't turning up. The vapid audience was turning up, so we have to reward that. But then, in this circumstance, he actually did send Bonnie away. So she was kind of like, well, what choice did I have? And I guess, if you're only making films to satisfy the vapid audience, what what chance does the sophisticated audience have to come to the party and see films if you're not even making them? Um, then he ends up in this getaway in the desert with June, and it's funny because throughout the whole film, they talk about sex scenes as being necessary to any film. Like, how are we going to get through the rest of it if there's no sex scene? And then they end up making the sex scene in this film like the best scene in the whole film. It's like a real like eye of the duck moment. It's Griffin is the whole time they're at the retreat is revealing the method to June. Like he's um, like she asked, does this do places like this really exist? And he says only in the movies. Like he's telling her like movies are not real. Like then they talk about David's idea for a film about him being in Japan, and Griffin said it lacks certain elements we need to market a film successfully. And then he lists all of them, and then he says mainly happy endings, and all the elements that he's listed are all elements that are present in the player. It is quite clever like that. And then June asks, "What about reality?" And then Griffin hits back at her, "You're not really from Iceland, are you?" And just like the studios, the audience, people make certain lies or half truths about themselves to appear more interesting. And he's saying, if you do it, we're going to do it. Then they go to have sex, and this is Hollywood and the vapid audience making love. This is the deal. We're going to be in it together. We're only going to make bad films from now on. That's the purpose of this scene. And Griffin is trying to confess to her, there's something you have to know. I have to tell you something about David's death. And June says, don't say any more. And he says, I have to tell you, please, I love you, don't. And, you know, she says, don't tell me, but she knows. She doesn't want to be told, but she knows all the same. And the next day, they're sitting in their mud baths, and it's pretty funny. They just look very awkward. And it's like, it's the day after they've done the deed, like, but they're in it together now. Griffin gets a call after that, and he has to go down to the police station and get picked out in a police lineup. And this old lady, who's I guess another standing member for the audience, can't pick him out. And it's like, even though we know that storytelling that Hollywood has kind of gone bad, as an audience, we can't put the finger on it. And the player, the film is basically calling us stupid. Like it's so obvious, like where things are going wrong, but you still can't pick the person out of the lineup. And then the movie ends with the film that Oakley had pitched about before, and instead of having no happy ending, the woman dying with no name actors, it's Julia Roberts and Bruce Willis like having the most insane happy ending possible, and everyone in the studio applauds. Bonnie, who's the sophisticated audience, she stands up and complains like, this is ridiculous, what happened to reality? And even Oakley, who was the one who was pushing no happy endings and no stars, he was like, well, we aired that version of the film and everyone hated it, and then we aired this version with the happy ending and the stars, and everyone loved it. So that's reality. And then Bonnie complains to Levy, and Levy just says, you're fired. And it's basically the film saying that, hey, sophisticated audience, like, we don't need you anymore. Like, you make a big song and dance about, hey, you love these art films, but you don't go and see them. We've got, the Junes of the world loving these predictable happy endings, and that's what we're going to go with. There's a question around, is it predictive? Is it like telling the audience, hey, this is what we want you to enjoy, versus, hey, this is reality? Like, more people simply enjoy that. Maybe a bit of both, but the film does seem like, it is somewhat genuine in saying, hey, like, we understand that we want to give you good films, but most of the audience doesn't want that, and that's not how we're going to make money. So the best we can offer you is this film, The Player, which it sort of does all of the elements of a good, or a film that will make money, so that we can get those audiences in. But we're also going to, wink, wink, nudge, nudge at you the whole time and say, yeah, we can see you, audience. But really, one of the best films I've seen in a long time. Interesting that it came out so long ago, because since this came out, it's only gotten 100 times worse. But if you haven't seen this film, please go and see it, because it's fantastic, especially if you love films. And if you have seen it, I hope you enjoyed my recap. It's just I've only seen it twice now in the last couple of weeks, but yeah, already one of my favorite films. But thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.